Welcome, Myra Barrs. It's very good to speak to you, and I'd like to talk to you about the book you've recently published called Vygotsky the Teacher, a companion to his psychology for teachers and other practitioners. Now, there's a lot in that title, but the first thing I've got to ask, why do you say Vygotsky the Teacher?
Oh, well, because I think he was always a teacher. That's well attested by the people that he worked with. He was an amazing, inspirational teacher. And of course, right from the very beginning of his career, when he returned to Gomel, his hometown, from having been at university in Moscow, he was able to teach. And that was already something, because prior to the sort of toleration legislation in 1917, he wouldn't have been able, as a Jew, he wouldn't have been able to take up that kind of profession. So, and he did so very enthusiastically in lots of different contexts with, young steel workers and workers' colleges, and preschool teachers in training, and then, quite extensively at Gomel Teachers Training College. So he was always a teacher, and thereafter, there are many, many occasions when you read about the sort of effect he had on people when he was publicly lecturing, which he did in, I think, a very improvisatory way. Although he was a terrific writer and wrote all the time, making notes and so on, he also, I think, developed his ideas through talking.
I've heard it said that he spoke fluently and without notes.
Yes.
Yes. His first book, in fact, was The Psychology of Education, wasn't it?
Yes, not published, I don't think. Or was it? I can't remember.
Yes, I think it was. It was his earlier work, which I'd like to ask you about, on the psychology of art, which is his university work, which wasn't published till much later.
No, that's right. But yes, educational psychology was the first book, I think, probably, in terms of what he produced as a final kind of manuscript. And it was based on his teaching. It was based on his teaching at Gomel Teachers College. And so it was clear from that book that he was already very well familiar with the psychology of the day, which was reflexology and reactology. That was what everybody knew, that was psychology, and he could use the language, but he had many criticisms of it, and they appear in that book. But he has no alternative at that point.
Of course, it was a strange world that he was getting involved in. Now, let's just step back a little bit to the psychology of art, because in terms of different approaches to understanding art, he really put emotion, didn't he, at the center of what he had to say about art. What did you make of his psychology of art?
Oh, I love it. I really like it. It's to me, it's a shapely book, and one which he's put a lot of thought into structuring. And it also is one that I think contains a lot of his later themes. It is, of course, a book about literature, or perhaps we should say literature and drama, since Hamlet's in there. And his best friend, Semyon Dobkin, said that was the general theme of his life. There was never a time when he wasn't interested. He was a great theatre goer, and he was a great reader of poetry. At one point, he began to try and publish poetry. He was fed by that. It was one of the things that nourished him most.
You know, it is said that for Piaget, the child was a budding scientist. And I get the feeling from what you say about Vygotsky, that for Vygotsky, the child was a budding dramatist. And maybe many parents would agree with that.
Yes, I think they would. And I think that, you know, when Vygotsky writes about young children, as in the lecture on play, very often what he's showing them doing is, well, he thought all real play was imaginative play, dramatic play. He says that, you know, simply playing with dolls in a routine kind of way is not real play. It's when the child begins to be a dramatist and to give, you know, do the voices and engage in the dramas. So that's play.
And this very interesting concept of the pivot has always intrigued me. It seems to be a very generative concept.
Yes, it is. He uses that term in relation to, you know, his classic example of a child who is playing horse, and how, in order, he says, to create the horse, in order to separate the word from its meaning, the child needs an object. He needs a stick, and through that stick, because he can bestride it and behave like a rider, the horse is created. So that's, yes, it's a beautiful, beautiful bit of argument there.
It's a very profound idea. Now look at the table of contents of your book. It's sort of, it's covering the complete scope of Vygotsky's work, and it's set out in the historical sense, that like the first work first and then one after the other in the course of his life. So it's like a kind of intellectual biography. Are you one of those that subscribes to the idea that there were periods in Vygotsky's life or turning points, and he disavowed everything that came before, and that there was one period in his life that was the real Vygotsky? I mean, what's your view about the course of his intellectual development?
Well, I mean, I think it's I think that it's very important to see the work in the context of his other work, always. And I think that there are always, obviously, he was developing constantly as a thinker. But that doesn't mean, sometimes he appears to be denying his previous work or belittling it. But I think he does that routinely because he's never satisfied. He's always wanting to go on to the next bit. And this was one of the things that disconcerted his colleagues, who were not always as ready to let go of what they'd got fond of. You know, so that, I mean, the great and remarkable period of his life when he's with a team of colleagues carrying out those play experiments, the instrumental period. And he's doing that in a laboratory which Luria is directing, but where he's working with Luria, Leontiev, and other, you know, a small group of other young psychologists. That is a brilliant part of his life. It's obviously fundamental to everything that comes after. But, you know, and he builds on that. He's continually moving on. But after that, he then, you know, he moves into pedology. He becomes interested not only in younger children, but in adolescents. He begins to study adolescence, and he's interested in pedology because it's a wider field than psychology. Obviously, psychology is basic to it, but actually it enables him to look at children as a whole, physically as well, their physical development as well as their mental and psychological development. And at a certain point, he writes, which it's one of my favorite pieces of writing, which is, where is it? It's called On Psychological Systems. And I think you've got that short text on the Marxist Archive, the Vygotsky part of the Marxist Archive. I really love it because he begins by saying he hasn't got a real argument. This is not a finished piece of writing. All he has, he says, are, a series of steps. And he goes on to make a series of statements about all drawn from work that he has done or they've done together, which together bring him to a view that the most important thing of all to study is psychological systems, not just, individual responses, but how all of these things interact and how all these aspects of mind interact. And that's thereafter what he's interested in. But of course, it's very difficult for his colleagues to follow him, partly because it's difficult what he wants them to do, very difficult. They can see means of investigating, children's growing mastery of the straightforward kind of psychological processes, memory, attention, and so on. What they cannot see at all is how you look at the interaction of these systems. And also it's a very inward thing that he's interested in studying. And by and large, it's kind of getting dangerous in Stalinist Russia to be so preoccupied with inward processes. You're supposed to be, interested in outward signs, activity, labor, etc., and not in the interior.
I noticed. Oh, sorry. Right in the beginning, in his Psychology of Education, there's you can see a section there on, as I recall, on what later became defectology. I mean, his interest in deaf and blind children, I think, was there early on. And this is an example, isn't it, of his system approach? Like, could you talk a bit about his approach to defectology?
Yes.
And also what the defectology is, a very politically incorrect word today.
It is indeed, yes. And it was used in Russia, for a very long time. I mean, it went right back into the 19th century. Nobody really thought about it. They just used it, as a term. They know what they meant. And in the same way, Vygotsky used it. And he worked as a defectologist. I think he had a chair of defectology at some point. At any rate, he taught defectology. But he does remark on it in the book, the volume of the complete works that deals with defectology. He does refer to the fact that there's an unfortunate term and, carries a negative load. On the other hand, again, he has no alternative to it. So, and it's institutionalized, if you see what I mean. So he carries on using it. However, he makes of it something very different, because one of the things he's dissatisfied with in conventional defectology is the narrow and limiting kind of approach to children with difficulties of various kinds. His particular specialism is blind children and deaf children, and then to an extent deaf-blind children. And what he is interested in looking at is not how, given their limitations, what can they do, which is generally construed as being very limited range of tasks, What he wants to know is how can they get around these deficits? How can they get around these obstacles? And the means he finds are the same as those that he found with the children solving problems. they can get around them by using signs, by using language, language being the greatest sign system. And so he looks at the way in which blind children acquire language and how that enables them to access a complete world, which is, entirely different from what they would be limited to by a lot of conventional defectological education.
Now, can I raise the ZPD, the zone of proximal development? I happen to know you have a great interest in this concept. I don't pretend that we can, in the space of a short period of time here, that you can explain the whole thing. But can you tell us something about how your interest in this developed and how? Just tell us more about ZPD, the things that you've found there.
Well, like almost everybody else, I imagine, I met the ZPD as, I think it's chapter 6 of Mind in Society, the interaction between learning and development. And that was in around 1980, I think. It had been published, Mind in Society, in 1978. And to me and to the people I was studying with on the MA course at that time, it seemed absolutely mind-blowing. It was wonderful because it seemed to be taking seriously. We were students of English in education. It seemed to be taking seriously collaboration as a means of learning and developing. It was a very enabling, it was a very kind of positive view of children's abilities and their ability, their ability to bootstrap themselves through interaction and through the and through teaching, through interaction with the teacher and with their peers.
What was your initial understanding of the concept at that time?
Well, I think everybody else felt just the same about it. It was looking to see how children's abilities could develop dramatically sometimes if they got the opportunity to work through problems with a teacher or more capable peer. That was the wording of Mind in the Society, though it was not Vygotsky's wording. And the little experiments that Vygotsky quoted in order to show this at work. And what he showed was that if you took two children of, say, 10, both of whom had a mental age, note, where is this mental age coming from, of 8, and you provided them with help to tackle a problem at, well, let's not get into the details of the problems, but anyway, a task. One might be able to complete it at the level of an 8.5-year-old, the other might be able to complete it at the level of 11-year-old. And he says, now are these children mentally the same? They've been adjudged to be the same by conventional tests, but are they truly mentally the same? And this was a very dynamic kind of idea that children could be dramatically different if given the right kind of experiences, the right kind of teaching, the right kind of opportunities. And also, as I say, it very much underlined the importance of language in learning. So all of that I was very excited by. It was after I'd worked on the translation of the lecture on play with Nikolai Verisov that I began to really wonder about mind in society in a big way. I'd already done some work on Tall and Simple, which is, you know, another favorite text. And I discovered the huge liberties that had been taken with that book in Mind in Society, with bits of it being cut out, divorced from their context and their overall argument, and made to serve a much more limited purpose. So there was that experience. There was the experience of looking at the play lecture. And I began to wonder whether anybody else had ever translated the interaction between learning and development. And I looked and looked and I couldn't find any evidence of another translation, certainly not one that was easily accessible. And I was in correspondence with Nikolai Verisov, and I asked him, could he send me a copy of the 1935 text, which he did, I think, by return of email. And then I thought, well, now I've got to get somebody really, really good to translate this because, you know, among my other disqualifying, you know, characteristics is for writing this book is I don't read Russian.
So this, Myra, just proves the thesis, doesn't it, of defectology. You had to find a way around it. And the result was a more profound understanding of the text than would otherwise be possible.
Well, I really thought that we ought to have an up-to-date, you know, complete. And I was wary of it because I thought, you know, they had been doing what they liked with these texts. They'd been cutting them, they'd been inserting things, you know. I wanted to see what it looked like as a whole. So through a friend, I found a very fine translator called Stanley Mitchell, who had translated Pushkin, Eugene Onegin for Penguin the year before or something like that. And he agreed to do it. And then I compared his translation line by line with the Mind in Society version, found very considerable differences. Insertions, so that, you know, one long, well-known passage is taken, it's true, from a text by Vygotsky, but an entirely different text with an entirely different thesis. And suppressions. So, for instance, there is an issue about the word obucheni and whether it should be translated teaching or learning. It was always, in Mind in Society, pretty well always translated as learning. In Stanley's translation, it was pretty well always translated as teaching. And I challenged him about this and I said, look, people feel very strongly about this. They think it's a very positive thing to see learning as the center of Vygotsky's work. Can obucheni never be translated as learning, in your opinion? And he said, only when it's learning with a teacher. So, you know, that was, I had to trust my translator. And it made a very big difference to the text. And what I found was that in the cases where it obviously meant teaching because of the surrounding text or the examples that Vygotsky gave, Mind in Society simply omitted them. So it was really censoring the original text because it had a view, a rather 1970s view of, you know, the value of learning as opposed to teaching. It was very far from seeing, you know, very far from being interested in pedagogy. What we found was that this text was fundamentally concerned with pedagogy. You know, some of the most classic statements in it, and I would have to look this up, which I guess you don't want me to do, but some of the most classic statements of it, if you put teaching instead of learning, which is how Stanley had translated it, changed the meaning altogether. And so I wrote a commentary to go alongside Stanley's translation, and they were both published in sorry, get mixed up, 2018, 2017, I think. So from that point of view, I was obsessed with it. And then I ended up knowing, a great deal about it. And through that, a great deal about what had happened to Vygotsky's texts. And I think Seth Chaiklin is the person who had done most work really on the different versions of the ZPD when, Vygotsky had written about it in lots of different contexts. And in almost every case, he'd interpreted it slightly differently. He presented it slightly differently. It probably arose in pedology, which we should explain as well, I suppose. But in general, it was, for him, a very generative idea. I think for him, it was an alternative to conventional assessment. And in pedology, and he was a pedologist, conventional assessment was the one of the main tools they had to work with. It was the same as here. Intelligence testing was very big in the same period in the West.
I understand pedology in Russia at the time meant the science of the child as a whole. Is that right?
Yes. The person who's done most work on this, I think, is Andy Blunden, and he calls it the science of the child, I think, child science.
There was some other versions of ZPD that come along later.
Well, there's one very narrow version of it, which was translated by Alex Kazulin, and that was published in 2011. And that is a complete exercise in detailed testing, showing that the ZPD tells you more than conventional tests. But my goodness me, there is an awful lot of, it is essentially being used as a test, an alternative form of testing. And Vygotsky tries to present it, although he gives no evidence that it's been subject to very extensive trials. And so, there is that on the one hand, which is much more conventional version of it. And on the other hand, there's the way in which he uses it in relation to children with difficulties, where it's obviously all part of a general view he has of the relationship between the child and the teacher. And in relation to this, I'd like to go back to tool and symbol, because I think that, Vygotsky is essentially talking in those play experiments about a kind of ZPD situation. The child is not able to do these things until he's given certain signs and, aids, auxiliary symbols to help him. And he decides very often, or she decides, how to use them. And the teacher is there. But what Vygotsky makes very clear in Tool and Simple, and the reason I like it so much, is that for the child, this is a human situation. He says the child always sees the teacher or the adult standing behind the problem. And the child will sometimes appeal to the teacher, to the tester, and ask for help in but sometimes simply tell the researcher what he's doing, what she's doing. And so for them, it's a social situation. And this in itself is part of the experience, it seems to me. And it can't be divorced from it. You can't pretend that the researcher's not really there, or that they're not having an influence, or they're not part of the general learning.
And we come to the last chapters of your book, which are on thinking and speech, Vygotsky's final work. You're continuing to follow his development in the structure of your own book. And you've actually devoted 2 of your chapters to thinking and speech. I'd like to press you a bit on the second chapter on thinking in speech, because that final chapter, I think it's chapter 7 of Thinking in Speech,
Yeah.
is really, I mean, it's very deep, isn't it? Could you talk to us a bit about that final chapter and what you found there?
Oh dear. Well, it's a very deep piece of thinking, and I think it goes right back as well to his early work. I think, you know, there are echoes in it of the psychology of art. There are echoes of it on the work on the imagination. Thought and Word is the culmination of the book. And if I can go back to the beginning of the book, what Vygotsky had decided in the first chapter is that he wanted to have a unit of analysis in this book. He needed a unit of analysis that preserved all the properties of what he was looking at. He didn't want to divide them, analyze them into their parts, because he wanted to see them working together. In just the same way, in the psychology of art, he had chosen to look at the work of art, the whole work of art, as the unit of analysis. In this book, he chooses the word as the unit of analysis, or rather, he chooses word meaning. And this seems, impossible in a way, to hang a whole book, a very complex book, just on that one unit. But what he does then is first of all, he looks at children's language development and the way in which words come to mean more, but also less, because for very small babies, single words can have enormous fuzzy meanings. And so they narrow down the meanings as they grow more experienced. But they also come to mean more because their meanings are more clearly defined. So he looks at that and compares his ideas with those of Piaget and Stern. Then he looks at word meaning in the concept. And obviously, concepts are a question of words coming to have very much more refined, very much more detailed meanings as the learner acquires a much clearer view of where they fit in relation to other concepts and in relation to a worldview. So that for him is another site where he can look at word meaning developing and becoming part of a child's psychology. And then finally, in this last chapter, he goes inside, because those other two things are, in a way, children engaging, openly with the world through speech, etc. In the last chapter, what he's looking at is inner speech. He's looking at the word going in, becoming a thought, and becoming verbal thought, and then emerging again. Very often in this chapter in literary form, because an awful lot of the examples that he takes are from literature, some from drama, and quite a number from poetry. So it's a very different chapter from the rest of the book, but it's obviously a very important direction to have taken, and one that it will be essential for him to look at if he wants to study the system of consciousness, which is his ultimate aim, and which he never succeeded in writing any complete text about. But I think that this book comes closest to actually tackling that in all its complexity.
Yeah, although the structure of your book deals with all the really well-known works of Vygotsky, you've used that as the structure for your book. It's very clear from talking to you that the sources that you've consulted are extremely wide. Can you talk to us a bit about the sources you went to and the journey you made in uncovering these very lesser known facets of Vygotsky's life?
Well, I was just being, I was obsessed. And so, yeah, I was obsessed for years, I suppose. And I was reading everything I could get my hands onto. And then, of course, I was reading more of certain kinds of writers, and because they were so illuminating. And I suppose the ones I found most illuminating initially was Nikolai Verisov's work. He had this very good book on undiscovered Vygotsky, the Vygotsky before the Vygotsky we know. So basically before 1924, I can't remember when he has a cutoff point. And I learned an enormous amount from the small amount of work that I did with Nikolai. I belatedly came to the work of Luciano Mecacci. I had seen some YouTube talks by him, but and I'd begun to consult the Italian edition of Thinking and Speech, Pensiero e Linguaggio, because it's an extraordinarily good edition, very, very scholarly. And, the notes on it, some of which point out the differences between the 1935 version and the one that appeared in the 60s and then was translated with the preface by Brunner. Was it 1962, I think?
62 is the much abused version, which was sort of sanitized for a Western audience, and then there was another version which appeared in volume 1 of his collected works, which is I don't know the provenance of it, but it's regarded more as the authoritative version.
Yes, it is. It's not very beautiful.
I agree. When I think there's Vygotsky refers to the word Aufheben, sublation, and it's very clear that the translator has no idea of the actual ramifications and the significance of that word for Marxism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I find it wanting on that score, and particularly I feel sorry that the translation that Alex Kazulin produced, though it was from the same base text, i.e. not the 1935 text, but I much prefer that in terms of its, linguistically, I think it's a much more responsive and attractive text. However, I used the collected works because you have to, really. I mean, that's the most recent, and it's also had the imprimatur, but in fact now it's obviously going to be superseded, isn't it?
Yes, evidently so, but at the moment it's the best we've got, and we have to have some text that is shared between everyone that can form the basis for discussing his works.